head would swell. I've always been easily swayed by suggestion. I am a marketer's dream. Then there are other kinds of tests, right? Tests of mental fortitude. Puzzles, like Sudoku and crossword puzzles. I'm okay with dabbling at those. Those keep the brain sharp, even though I fail sometimes to even finish one of those. Then there's Scrabble and words with friends. Some of you do that on the internet, and you will not see a friend request to play Scrabble with me unless it's only about 3-word answers. That's all I can do with those. Next are tests of strength. Carrying a full laundry basket up 2 flights of stairs does me in. So when we were in Scotland and we're at the Highland Games and we're watching those heavies, the big guys that are tossing stuff around all day long, the caber toss, at the end of the day, after event after event, they're picking up these 137-pound telephone poles and they're tossing them end over end. I would be through after the warm-up round. And I'm not sure whether you call them character, obedience, or common sense tests, but I remember being a Boy Scout. I remember going out on my very first snipe hunt. Yeah, before you judge, I won that test. I stayed out there the longest. I've never been comfortable with tests. And so when a Bible story like this one comes along, in which God tests God's people, my first impulse is to turn and run. Drop that snipe sack and head for the hills. But because our disciples' theology claims a God of grace, a God of love, a God of hope, a God of redemption. We identify with a God who cries when we cry and hurts because we hurt. We do not believe in a God that causes bad things to happen. Hurricanes and forest fires are not a result of human sexuality or the shallowness of our faith. Now, to be clear, our choices do have an impact on other people. The decisions we make do have consequences on God's creation. We should claim culpability, but tests from God aren't a passing judgment cast upon us. Trials in life are not a test that God gives to learn of our faithfulness or our resolve. And so this understanding of God doesn't mesh with our text. Also, this story doesn't fit with the words of God in Genesis 17. If you remember that chapter, it's still about Abraham and Sarah. Here, God promises that Abraham and Sarah will have a son, and they will name him Isaac. God says to Abraham, I establish my covenant with him, and as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. There they are, Abraham and Sarah, late in life, and they are to bear a son who will be a sign of God's promise for generations. So come on already. There has been a test or two in Abraham and Sarah's relationship. There has been a test, a time or two, between Abraham and his relationship with his God. God wouldn't make another test. Surely, would God? But a few chapters later, we see here that God demands Isaac be bound and sacrificed. This text doesn't make sense to me on so many levels. So I had to dig deep. I had to go into research this week in order to find something that made sense to my soul, that I could preach with integrity. I can't even say the word, can I? Integrity. Something that I could speak and preach with honesty. It's important for us to remember, though, at this time, the time in which Abraham lived, they were in a culture where the gods with a lowercase g would often ask for and require a human sacrifice. It wouldn't be unusual for Abraham to watch his neighbors walking up to that place of sacrifice, to that high place, taking only their child with them. And we know, many of us, there are other places in Scripture, over 30 accounts, especially in Exodus and Deuteronomy and Leviticus, where God is trying to remind the Israelites that they're not to sacrifice their children. So the practice was definitely around, but the one true God had different expectations. It's also important for us to remember how the voice of God was often heard. You and I hear the voice of God in different ways. Abraham did too. Probably the two key ways in which Abraham heard the voice of God was, one, directly from God. We know that he often talked with God. And we know that when God was talking directly to Abraham, Abraham had a way of talking back, and maybe in that very way of talking back to God. He wasn't afraid to bargain or ask or stand up to God when he didn't fully understand what God was asking of him. He could be bold and he could be strong, already showing signs of a good leader of the people. But this time, in our text this morning, Abraham obeys the voice silently, with no question, with no argument, and with no plea. After so long, to now have a son promised to Sarah, his beloved wife, his pride and joy. They were going to have a son, only, wait, he's about to be sacrificed, and there is no defense, there is no standing up to God. This is the most uncharacteristic account of his relationship with God to this point. This story has never sat well for me. I've never questioned whose voice Abraham was hearing with this text until doing my homework for today. I am so glad I came upon the work of Presbyterian minister Terry Peterson, because she reminds us there's other ways in which we hear the voice of God. She reminds us that Abraham could have been hearing the voice of God presented from his neighbors. Other people talk to us on God's behalf, don't we? She said, could it be that this is the story of Abraham hearing the voice of another God through the voices of his neighbors, and then the one true God stepping in and calling off this horror at the very end? I found that to be interesting. We know that the story ends with God providing, and in so doing, God puts a definitive end to the practice of human sacrifice, grabbing Abraham's hand, and by extension, our hands too, and taking the knife away. It is not okay for us to sacrifice one another on any altar. I make no mistake, there are plenty of voices we, like Abraham, think are perfectly reasonable. They ask us to sacrifice our children on the altar of prosperity. If you want success, work harder. If you truly want to provide for your family, put in overtime. We make choices. We sacrifice our children on so many altars because we think that we're supposed to in order to maintain national security or morality. What is best and good for our children kind of falls by the wayside. We're asked to sacrifice our children for the sake of our military reputation or our economy or global power. These voices ask us to sacrifice our children for profit, for safety, for our understanding of what is right. Something has to give, and what do we often do? It's the children. These voices claiming holiness tell us it's okay to sacrifice some children, or some poor people, or some poor elderly. These false gods surround us, and over they ask us to forget. They ask us to forget things like in 1963, this very weekend in Birmingham, in a church where 4 girls died in Sunday school class when a bomb went off because their skin was the wrong color, sacrificed to self-righteousness. Often voices ask us to forget that poverty fuels violence that has claimed the lives of thousands of children in our country alone, sacrificed to apathy. They ask us to forget that the things we buy often perpetuate a circle of violence and despair that destroys the lives of children, sacrificed to convenience. The list of ways we sacrifice, often unintending to, occurs over and over again because those voices are all around us, suggesting ways we sacrifice our children and have it be perfectly normal. But our one true God doesn't welcome that sacrifice. The children of every generation, the children of today, are a blessing in the eyes of God. They are our future, and God believes in them. And yet we're quick to forget the promise of Isaac. I will make a covenant with this child and generations to follow. In many ways, we still face a test. Not necessarily one developed by God, but are we listening for our one true God? Are we accepting the grace and promise that God is trying to provide? Will we listen to the voice of God who says, "Give me the knife. It's not okay to sacrifice one another on any altar. Period. No more. I am a God of life. I am the God of abundant life, the God of love, the God of grace, the God of justice, the God of peace. My faithfulness is not contingent on your faithfulness." There are voices of other gods, compelling voices, but their call always leads to destruction. Our God's call leads to life. Are we willing to echo that voice of true life? If life as we know it is some sort of test, how will we answer? If that text brings about more questions for you than it does answers, I completely and wholly understand. There are things we may not always understand. Like, for one, why this table had to be so significant in our way of life and our walk of faith. Why a sacrifice on Jesus' account was one that we must remember each and every Sunday. It's a part of